heavy hitters saw the release of Tenacity. We all immediately recognized it as the sister card to one of the OGs, Salt the Wound, which itself has seen tons of play over the years. But with a high bar to reach, is Tenacity better or worse than Salt? The obvious answer, of course, is it depends. But when does it depend? When should you use which, or is there a case for running both? A huge shout out to our channel members for supporting what we do here. If you want to get involved with the channel and the Dice Commando community, please consider joining as a channel member. Remember, these videos are only possible with your support. You can show that support with a like, a subscribe, and by leaving us a comment and sharing your feedback. Community first, and go Commando. Hey there, my flesh and blood friends, welcome back to Dice Commando and a fabulous cast, and today I'm going to be discussing and comparing both Salt the Wound and Tenacity, and we'll be going over some case studies to highlight the best use cases of each. Now, over the history of the game, we've had a class of certain cards that stand out as efficient chain enders, and with the release of heavy hitters, we add another tool to that arsenal. Tenacity is a generic attack action of Majestic rarity that has base 2 attack, but gains +1 attack for each defending card on the combat chain when it is played. Because equipment counts as a defending card, Tenacity has some really high potential value. It is important to note, not just for the context of a value discussion, but also from a rules perspective, that Tenacity determines its buff at the time of the card being played. Meaning, cards added to the chain to defend Tenacity, or any following chain link, do not affect the buff. Tenacity only counts defending cards at the time it leaves your hand as an attacking card. Now of course, the formula on Tenacity should seem familiar, as it's a sister ability to the ninja staple card, Salt the Wound. Also a base 2, Salt gets +1 attack for each attack that has hit on the combat chain. Now, one very important difference between these two jumps out right away. Salt is limited to the ninja class, whereas Tenacity is generic. So obviously, if you're looking outside of the ninja class, well, there you automatically have your answer. Take Boltyn, for example. Tenacity has found its way into some Boltyn lists as both a yellow and a decent chain ender, especially if it trails a Lumina turn where they're trying to block those sword swings. But even as a direct comparison of the two cards within the ninja class itself, Salt the Wound isn't simply just an automatic windmill slam include. In fact, I'll argue that you have to choose carefully based on your deck build, even within existing ninja decks. To baseline this discussion, let's put both cards up against the fundamental flesh and blood value line, which can be set by comparing to yellow Wounding Blow. All 3 cards cost 0, all 3 cards are yellow, and all 3 cards defend for 3. At 3 attack with no ability, Wounded Blow sets the foundation for expected value off of a card. So with their base 2 attacks, what this means is that in order to be worth playing, Salt and Tenacity each need to get a minimum of 2 triggers for a buff of 2 or more. Otherwise, you're fundamentally losing value or carrying a contingency. In other words, unless we expect to get at least +2 bonus off these cards, there's no fundamental reason to include them in our decks over Wounded Blow. Even at +1, it's even value, but you carried the opportunity cost. Also, I would like to point out that this also helps to really put the value expectations into perspective, right? Sure, we all dream of a Salt the Wound for 7, but realistically, a 4 or 5 attack is a pretty decent expectation and above rate value. That statement, however, comes with one very important caveat. We are assuming value as compared to a yellow pitch slot card, which is, admittedly, a bit of a logical fallacy. Now sure, there's value, especially in like a low profile Kodachi build or the aforementioned Boltyn build, to having a 0 cost yellow. But if we're being realistic about what we're trying to do in our chain ender slot, to be fair to ourselves, we need to be really comparing to a red pitch curve. In other words, using red Wounding Blow versus the yellow version. And I think this makes a lot of sense. If you're looking at the cards in a non-combo vacuum, wouldn't you rather tech in a 4 trigger 0/5 Lava Burst or an always usable Snatch? And thus, going forward, we're going to be upping the bar, so to speak, to get a minimum of 3 triggers for a buff of 3 or more, to really be worth the slot. And if we're being realistic, that very much changes the conversation in terms of what these cards have to be able to do. To baseline, let's again look at what each of these cards fundamentally does. Both cards scale their bonus with more triggers, and both lend themselves to longer combat chains. Now, to be fair, Tenacity would technically work well as a follow-up to, say, a covered Crush card that came in with Go Again. That said, it really doesn't fit into that overall strategy. as on its own, anything that swings less than a weapon, with no go again, and itself can't pay for a weapon, is a bad include. So with that point understood, for the rest of this video, we'll focus primarily on the multiple link combat chains. Salt excels when you're running many small attacks with no on hits. With no reason to block, the opponent will typically prefer to bleed small amounts of damage versus committing cards to the block. In such a case, they generally won't throw cards except to stave off static triggers like Mask of Momentum or so on, which leads to a larger Salt in the Wound attack. In contrast, Tenacity excels when you create situations that force opponents to block. This is accomplished not just by things like mass triggers, but also cards with on-hit triggers. Cards like Bittering Thorns and Mounting Anger will draw blocks, and as a bonus, in being breakpoint attacks can potentially draw 2 blocking cards. In the case shown here, we have a pretty standard Kodachi Ninja type line, and in fact it's even a little low in terms of the standard number of cards on the chain. But with each of these attacks coming in for 1, potentially 2 on the second due to Tiger Shuko, and no on-hits threatened other than a potential Mask of Momentum trigger, you're looking at the likelihood of a pretty decent Salt to Wound. If you were running Tenacity in this situation, it likely comes in for +1, maybe +2, but unlikely. Salt is very clearly the right decision in this type of situation. But now let's flip the case study over to a Draconic Phi line. Kicking off the chain with a card like Mounting Anger, or an analogous card could be Bittering Thorns, the on-hit is typically enough to draw out blocks. On top of that, unless they have a 4 block like Sync or Fate, it's a good chance you suck out a hand and an armor piece. Right away you have a potential +2 bonus on Tenacity. As the chain moves on, the 3 attacks also lend themselves to sucking out more blocks. It's very common that the Emberblade sees a block, as it can't get Ancestraled or otherwise, and the Phoenix Flame likely goes through, as does the Brand, so this sets you up for a likely 5-attack Tenacity. In fact, just a few weeks ago at our Armory event, I was on Phi and Blitz, and was able to Tenacity for 7 by presenting on-hits to my opponent. Now yes, one of that is from Shuko, but the rest was generating by presenting on-hits that encouraged blocking from the opponent. So I get it, those case studies are all well and good, but sure, one can argue that each is custom tailored to make my point. And you're not wrong, but I am using them to show the difference in practical function. On the ultimate surface, if you're running Kodachis and a go-wide strategy, then it probably makes sense to continue to run Salt to Wound. With the Kodachis and another card, there's an excellent chance that your minimum Salt is for 4 on most turns. I would point out though, that as per our success criteria, you'd be better off running a red 0/4 like Snatch or something like that. But on the other hand, Salt itself is a 0 which can pitch for both Kodachis, so it does seem like a fair include. If you're running something more like a traditional Draconic Phi, then I believe you should skew over to Tenacity. Cards like Mounting Anger, Bittering Thorns, Whelming Gustwave, and even the criminally underplayed Soaring Strike all present interesting breakpoint must blocks that on their own can threaten multi-blocks to get multiple plus triggers. And in the newly released Zen, or any hero running something like a Crouching Tiger line, well, choose carefully. An Art of War or Roar the Tiger type line into Predatory Streak certainly favors a super wide turn, and thus Salt to Wound. But many of the newer cards actually look to on-hits to create Crouching Tigers. This then incentivizes blocking, and thus favors Tenacity. The mask you're running obviously factors into this as well from a certain standpoint. Mask of Momentum will nearly always be worth a block card, or not, I suppose, but then with that extra card you're probably not overly butthurt about your Tenacity losing +1. Link's Mask is an interesting case because it can, in a way at least, force blocks, but because it's so hard to manage the trigger for the entire game, it likely doesn't factor into my terms of planning for Tenacity. So let's move this forward into the conclusion space. When do we run each, and how does that translate to the current meta space where Katsu is a legitimate meta threat? With the surging combo lines, which should Katsu be running? My argument is Tenacity, and on paper, that might go against the inherent math shown above, but I think there's logic there, so let's talk through it. Let's head on over to the Bonds combo line. Now, aside from the ultimate ender of Dishonor, none of these inherently has an on-hit. So as per the arguments above, you're saying, but Andrew, this should favor Salt, right? But remember, Katsu himself is an ever-present on-hit, which allows you to tutor out a missing combo piece. Thus, someone trying to disrupt the combo pop-off is required to block. You're also looking at this and saying, well, why would I even want to play Tenacity in this case? I'll just play Dishonor instead. And you're completely absolutely right, except for one important part. what if they are able to block you successfully, preventing you from getting the Katsu trigger? Unless you naturally have the combo pieces in hand, in which case you can always discard that Tenacity to pull your combo piece, then your line fizzles. Having a Tenacity to follow all that up and get bonuses for the fails absolutely seems like the right play here. And that's part of my point here regarding Salt versus Tenacity. In the case where they are letting you hit, which would favor Salt, you're able to do what you want to do with your combo lines, and thus, Salt becomes irrelevant. It's only if they are stopping you from doing what you want that the slot filled by Salt or Tenacity becomes relevant, and that's ultimately why I believe Tenacity to be the more valuable include. It effectively acts as a bailout, a very legitimate bailout, I may add. So yes, on paper, Salt mathematically has the potential to come in for more, and can do crazy things in Magical Christmas Land. But from a practical standpoint, I believe Tenacity serves as a more functional card in this particular role. Now, let's go ahead and circle back to something we talked about earlier in the episode. We also need to put this into context, again, with the bar that we set earlier in the episode, of it effectively needing to come in for 5 to be worth effective value. Let's say you do get an undefended line finishing with Salt. In this particular case, Salt would come in for 6, which is awesome. But remember, you're doing this in place of a Dishonor. Dishonor as a blue is coming in for 4. Converting that to a yellow value line, that's a 5, which means that you're only gaining 1 value on Assault to lose the combo potential. On the flip side, if you're using Tenacity as your bailout, even on a 2-card failed combo line would convert to a minimum of 5. So yes, whereas Salt has a higher ceiling, Tenacity has a significantly higher and more consistent floor. So as a general rule, the situations we outlined in the first part of this episode very much hold. Kodachis will, generally, lend more to Salt, whereas an action-based line will lend better to Tenacity. But in the combo-heavy Katsu deck, using Tenacity as your bailout, I think is the right call. But to each their own. What do you think, Ninja folks? Is my logic flawed? Hope to hear from you in the comments below. Thanks for watching, my Ninja friends, and go Commando.